Chapter 9. Continued. He awoke again with Kjaran beside him, looking worried. "Kjaran," he said. "They told me," she answered. "Ansett, I'm sorry." "I'm not," Ansett said. "Joseph couldn't have known, and I didn't know. It was the Songhouse. They could have told me." Kjaran nodded, but her mind was on something else. "Caleb won't authorize a search for Joseph. He keeps saying that he hopes he falls off a cliff. It's raining out there. You don't know, Ansett. Joseph tried to commit suicide before. It's been years, but he might do it again." Ansett was instantly alarmed. He sat up, and was surprised to find that his head did not hurt very badly, and that he was only languid, not incapacitated. "Then we have to find him. Call the chief of security." She called him. He came in a matter of moments. "We have to organize a search for Joseph," Ansett said. "I find it hard to believe that no search has been organized up to now." The chief looked at the floor. "Not really," he said. "He may be suicidal," Ansett said, letting the outrage pour into his voice. "Caleb didn't ask for a search, sir, but I wouldn't have organized one anyway." Ansett could not believe the insubordination from these men, who, in the last 2 years, he had thought were dependable. "Then you would have been removed from office, as you are right now." "As you wish, sir, but I wouldn't have organized a search for Joseph because I know where he is." His voice was still uncertain. He may know where Joseph is, Ansett thought, but he certainly doesn't know how Joseph is. "Who has him? Where is he?" "Imperial security, sir. It was only natural. We didn't know what had happened to you. We suspected an attempt had been made on your life. It was only 3 hours after we got you that we found what was wrong, and in the meantime we had notified the Emperor. He left standing orders with me to let him know if anything happened to you." "Imperial security has Joseph," Kjaran said numbly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "The ferret told me not to tell you until you asked." "The ferret gives orders that you aren't to notify me of something this important?" The chief looked uncomfortable. "The Emperor always backs Ferret up in what he says, and you must understand, sir, finding you the way we did, with Joseph the way he was." "How was he?" Kjaran demanded. "Stark naked," the chief said blandly, "and screaming his lungs out. We thought he tried to bugger you with something, sir. We had no idea what was going on. You never know with homosexuals." Kjaran slapped the chief, which he took calmly. "You don't deal with them like I do," he said. "This sort of thing happens a lot." "What sort of thing?" Ansett said, taking Kjaran's hands and holding them. She was trembling. "It happens all the time that the Songhouse drugs nearly kill someone? I mean violence. Homosexuals are like that." "Joseph isn't," Ansett said. "Joseph isn't at all, and therefore your theory isn't worth shit." He made his voice as ugly as possible. He saved vulgarity for times when he needed it, and it pleased him that the chief winced. "Now get us a direct flight to Susquehanna. There isn't any from Caernarvon. There is now, and it will take off in 15 minutes. It took off in 15 minutes, and Ansett and Kjaran sat together in the empty commercial jet. There was only one steward. They dismissed him immediately. The security guards, much against standard procedure, were following in another plane. Ansett was still weak, but the tension had helped him to keep going during the rush to the port. Now he relaxed, not sleeping but not wholly awake, lost in his thoughts. After a while, however, he realized that Kjaran might need company more than he needed rest. She stared out the window at the ocean below, motionlessly, but her hands were white from gripping the armrest on the seat, which was rigid to match her tension. "Kjaran," he said, "he'll be all right. I can clear this up with Richter's in a short time." She nodded, but said nothing. "That isn't all, is it?" She shook her head. "Does it bother you that Joseph and I were together? I didn't think it would, but he acted as if he thought it might." "No," she said. "I don't mind you being together." "But what?" she asked. "You were thinking, but. You don't mind, but." She looked at her lap, and intertwined her fingers nervously. "Ansett, the first time you and he met, 2 years ago, when you came home with me for a salad?" Ansett smiled. "I remember." "Joseph told me that he thought he was going to fall in love with you." "Did you mind?" "Why should I mind?" she answered, her voice jumpy with emotion. "There's plenty of love. What should I care? I love both you and him, you know, and you love both of us. But he kept talking as if it were something that could only... As if once he loved you, he would have to stop loving me. He said that. He said that if he ever made love to you, it would be. It would be what? It would be after he stopped loving me. It sounded like nonsense to Ansett, but then he realized that, whether he meant to or not, he had so far loved serially. Este and then McCall and then Richter's and then Kjaran. But did he love Kjaran less for having loved Joseph? Of course not. Yet now Joseph's actions made sense. If he really believed that, then it made a perverse sort of sense for him to have resisted his own desire for Ansett so long, for him to have avoided becoming friends with Ansett, knowing what it would cost him if it ever became more than friendship. "Where's Ephraim?" Ansett asked. "I left him in Caernarvon with the wife of the Minister of Information." "Joseph still loves you," Ansett said. She looked at him and tried to smile in agreement, but her heart wasn't in it. Joseph was in the custody of Imperial security, and it had happened because he had done the thing he had said would mean the end of them. And what about Ephraim? "There's always the contract," Kjaran said, and wept. Ansett put his arms around her, held her head against his chest. He was surprised to realize that he was taller than Kjaran now. He was growing up. Soon he would be a man. He wondered what that would mean. Surely he could not have more required of him as an adult than had been required of him as a child. There could not be more. Chapter 10. Richter's received them in the great hall. There were no guards, only Ferret, but Ansett and Kjaran knew that he was guard enough. The mayor of the palace brought them in, but at Richter's nod, he left. Kjaran was keenly aware of the tension in the air. None was visible from Ansett, but Kjaran knew that didn't mean anything. Control still served him when he needed it, usually, and the tension in Richter's was clear. Kjaran had not seen the man close up. He had the imperial presence, the mood about him so that no one dared oppose him. Yet he also seemed afraid, as if Ansett held a weapon that could hurt him, and he was terrified that it would be used. She knew they had not seen each other in 2 years, knew also from her conversations with Ansett that they had not parted on friendly terms. Yet they outwardly seemed pleased to see each other, and Kjaran did not think it was a sham. "I have missed you," Richter said. "And I you," Ansett answered. "My servants tell me you've done very well." "Better than I expected. Not as well as I had hoped," Ansett said. "Come here," Richter said. Ansett walked forward, came within a few meters of the throne, and knelt, touching his head to the floor. Impatiently, Richter's motioned for him to arise and come closer. "You don't need to do that kind of thing, not when there's no audience. But I've come to ask a favor from the throne." "I know you have," Richter said, and his face darkened. "We'll discuss that later. How have you been?" "Reasonably good health, surrounded by reasonably helpful people. I've come for Joseph. He's innocent of any crime." "Is he?" Richter's asked. And Kjaran's heart suddenly grew heavy in her chest, and she felt something go out of her. She identified it a moment later as confidence. She had been expecting no resistance, just an error, to be rectified as soon as there was an explanation. What crime had Joseph committed? Why was the Emperor delaying and arguing? She knew the answer as she asked the question. Joseph had been making love to McCall's songbird. Even the Emperor had not made love to McCall's songbird. Joseph had had what the Emperor had not even asked for. But had he wanted it? Was that the reason for his anger and delay? "He is innocent," Ansett said slowly, but danger crept into his voice. "I want to see him." "Is this Joseph all you can think of?" asked Richter's. "There was a time when you would have sung for me first, when you would have come to me full of songs." Ansett said nothing. 2 years! Cried Richter's, the emotion taking control of his voice. "In 2 years you haven't visited, you haven't tried to visit." "I didn't think you'd want me." "Want you?" said Richter's, getting some of his dignity back. "Ever since I came here, this place was full of your music, and then gone. For 2 years, silence, and the babble of fools. Sing for me, Ansett." But Ansett was silent. Richter's watched him, and Kjaran realized this was the price that Richter's expected to be paid. A song in exchange for Joseph's freedom. A cheap price, if only Ansett still had any songs in him. And Richter's didn't know. How could he not have known? "Sing for me, Ansett!" Richter's cried. He can't, Kjaran answered. She glanced at Ansett, but he was standing quietly, regarding Richter's impassively. Control. Just another thing that she had been unable to master in the songhouse. What do you mean he can't? Asked Richter's. I mean that he's lost his songs. He hasn't sung anything. Not since he left you. Not since you... Not since I what? He dared her to go on. Dared her to condemn him. Not since you locked him in McCall's rooms for a month, she dared. He can't lose his songs, Richter said. He was trained since he was 3. He can and he did. Don't you realize? He doesn't learn songs. He learns how to discover them, inside himself, and bring them out to the surface. Do you think he memorized them all and chose the right one for the proper occasion? They came from his soul and you broke him, and now he can't find them anymore. Her anger surprised her. She had listened sympathetically to Ansett. It had never occurred to her how much she had come to hate Richter's for Ansett's sake, which was odd, for Ansett had never even hinted at hatred for Richter's, only hurt. Richter seemed not to notice the impertinence of her tone. He only looked wonderingly at Ansett. Is it true? Ansett nodded. Richter's dropped his head into his hands, which rested on the arms of the throne. What have I done? He said. His hands twisted in his hair. He really grieves for Ansett's loss, Kjaran thought, and realized that despite all he had done to hurt Ansett, he still loved him. And so, fumbling, she offered some words to assuage the blow that had just struck him. It wasn't just you, she said. It was the songhouse, really, what the songhouse did, cutting him off here. You don't know what the songhouse means to people like him. She had almost said us. I knew there were bastards there who didn't care for any of us, but they get chains on you and never let go. Beside her, Ansett was shaking his head. It's true, Ansett. It was bad enough for them to strand you here without warning, but when they didn't even prepare you for what happened, what the drugs would do to you... She didn't finish. She merely turned to Richter's, who did not seem to be listening, and said, It's the songhouse that hurt him most. He did hear. He sat up and looked much relieved, though there was still tension in him, even for Kjaran to see, who did not know him. Yes, he said, it's the songhouse that hurt him most. Suddenly Ansett stepped forward, toward the throne. He was angry. Kjaran was surprised. She had been the one speaking, and yet he seemed angry at Richter's. That was a lie, Ansett said. Richter's only looked at him, startled. I know your voice, Richter's, know it as well as I know my own, and that was a lie. And not just a small one, Richter's. That was a lie that matters to you right to the core, and I want to know why it's a lie. Richter's did not answer, but after a few moments he looked away from Ansett, glanced toward Ferret, who immediately came forward. Stay where you are, Ansett commanded, and Ferret, surprised by the ferocity of his voice, obeyed. Ansett spoke again to Richter's. It was not the songhouse that hurt me most, then. Richter's shook his head. Where is the lie, Richter's? I was cut off from the songhouse, and that has cost me more than any other loss I have ever sustained, even the loss of McCall, even the loss of your friendship. And you say that it was not the songhouse that hurt me most? Who was it, then? Who was it who cut me off from them? Chapter 9. Continued. He awoke again with Kjaran beside him, looking worried. Kjaran, it's raining out there. You don't know, Ansett. Joseph tried to commit suicide before. It's been years, but he might do it again. Ansett was instantly alarmed. He sat up, and was surprised to find that his head did not hurt very badly, and that he was only languid, not incapacitated. Then we have to find him. Call the chief of security. She called him. He came in a matter of moments. Leave the insubordination from these men, who, in the last 2 years, he had thought were dependable. Then you would have been removed from office, as you are right now. As you wish, sir. But I wouldn't have organized a search for Joseph because I know where he is. His voice was still uncertain. He may know where Joseph is, Ansett thought. We have to organize a search for Joseph, Ansett said. I find it hard to believe that no search has been organized up to now. The chief looked at the floor. Not really, he said. He may be suicidal, Ansett said, letting the outrage pour into his voice. Caleb didn't ask for a search, sir, but I wouldn't have organized one anyway. Ansett could not believe, he said. They told me, she answered. Ansett, I'm sorry. I'm not, Ansett said. Joseph couldn't have known, and I didn't know. It was the Songhouse. They could have told me. Kjaran nodded, but her mind was on something else. Caleb won't authorize a search for Joseph. He keeps saying that he hopes he falls off a cliff.